Provost Fireball, Colonel Retired Sheets, Dr. Luntz, Mr. Turner, debaters, guests, and friends. I am honored to welcome you to the 10th Army-Navy Debate Classic. Special thanks to the craft event organizers for their coordination and to the City of Boston and the National Park Service who managed this incredible historic venue. I am Major Anthony Davila, an instructor of economics and tactical officer at West Point. I have the pleasure to serve as the OIC of the West Point debate team and to open this year's event. For more than 275 years, Fennell Hall has been a significant site for pivotal civic events, including meetings, protests, celebrations, and debates. As a frequent gathering place during the Revolutionary era, this hall has become a symbol for the struggle to define American liberty over the centuries. It has hosted a diverse array of groups, including abolitionists, women's rights activists, and labor advocates, all contributing to the hall's rich legacy as a locus for public discourse. Today, we're here to witness a contest of will and skill between the brilliant minds of our nation's oldest service academies. These debaters, future leaders in their respective services, embody the intellectual rigor and commitment to excellence that are hallmarks of our officer corps. The Army-Naval rivalry is fierce and it is legendary, but is built upon mutual respect and a shared purpose: to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and to win our nation's wars. As our compatriots prepare to face off on the athletic fields of friendly strife, today's debate is a chance to face off in academic conflict as each team brings their intellectual weapons to bear. This year, our teams will debate a reduction in U.S. nuclear arms posture, challenging our participants to demonstrate both strategic and analytical skills. Our judging panel consists of the following eminent individuals. Brigadier General Retired Mike Meese serves as president of the American Armed Forces Mutual Aid Association. He is a leader in military and veterans issues, including chairing the 2016-2017 transition team for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Brigadier General Meese retired from the United States Army as a Brigadier General, having concluded his 32-year career while serving as professor and head of the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. He served in a variety of strategic political military positions, including deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Bosnia, for a total of 31 months, and was the executive director for the Secretary of the Army's transition team in 2005. He's a graduate of the National War College, United States Military Academy, and earned his PhD, MPA, and MA from Princeton University. Provost Samara Fireball is the Provost of the United States Naval Academy. She graduated magna cum laude from Princeton University with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and received her master's and PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1997 and 2001, respectively, both also in electrical engineering. Dr. Fireball's area of scholarship is microelectrochemical systems, and particularly in integrated sensors and microrobotics. Dr. Fireball joined the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at the Naval Academy in 2001 and has served in several roles at the Academy, including Vice President of the Faculty Senate, Chair of the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department, and most recently the Associate Provost for Academic Affairs. Dr. Craig Sheets is the Vice Dean for Engagement and Research at the United States Military Academy. Prior to assuming his current role, he served as Executive Vice President and as Dean of the School of Natural Science and Mathematics at Mount St. Mary's University from 2018 to 2023. In 2018, Colonel Craig retired from active duty after more than 28 years of service. Early in his Army career, he served as a tactical military intelligence officer, but spent the second half of his career at West Point, serving as an academy professor in the Department of Physics and Nuclear Engineering, affectionately known among cadets as the Department of Pain. He also served as director of the Dean's Staff and Vice Dean for Operations. He holds a bachelor's in geophysics from Millersville University, a master's in geophysics from New Mexico Tech, a master's in applied physics from the Naval Postgraduate School, and a PhD in applied physics from the Colorado School of Mines. His research interests are ultra-short pulse laser design and development of femtosecond laser-based nonlinear microscopy systems. Dr. Frank Luntz is a renowned political consultant, pollster, and communications specialist. He's been a pivotal figure in political communication and public opinion analysis for several decades. He is best known for his expertise in crafting the language of political and public policy debate, influencing both national and international discourse. Dr. Luntz's work extends beyond politics. He is highly sought after for his insight in corporate communication, having advised Fortune 500 companies on messaging and branding strategies. He's also a frequent commentator and analyst on various news networks, where his expertise in public opinion is widely respected, including his recurring segments on MSNBC, CNBC, 100 Days, 1,000 Voices, which won an Emmy Award in 2001. He's the author of several influential books. Dr. Luntz has significantly impacted the way leaders and organizations communicate. His innovative approach to understanding public opinion and crafting effective messages has earned him recognition as one of the most honored communication professionals in America today. Dr. Luntz holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania and a doctorate in politics from Trinity College at Oxford University. Mr. John Turner is the Kenneth M. Strange Director of Debate for Dartmouth Forensic Union since 2015. John won the Ross K. Smith Coach of the Year Award in 2022. He coached back-to-back National Debate Tournament Championship teams in 2022 and 2021, as well as a Rex Copeland Award-winning team in 2021. While coaching for Dartmouth as an assistant from 2003 to 2009, John helped teams reach the finals of the National Debate Tournament and 3 Cross-Examination Debate Association National Tournament finals. During his tenure, 4 teams received top 5 first-round bids to the National Debate Tournament. As a student, while debating at Dartmouth, he reached the CETA National Semifinals and received a first-round at-large bid to the National Debate Tournament. John received a master's degree in Communication Studies from the University of Georgia and a bachelor's degree in Comparative Literature from Dartmouth. Please join me in a round of applause for our distinguished panel. Speaking on behalf of the affirmative from Navy is Midshipman Armin Ray, physics major with a minor in Arabic, hailing from Dallas, Texas. He serves as the Navy debate team's treasurer. Midshipman Truman Connor is a political science major from Mission Hills, Kansas. He qualified for the 2023 High School Tournament of Champions in Policy Debate. Speaking on the negative, Cadet Valentin Shadalenko is an economics major of the class of 2025 from Rogers, Arkansas. He's the captain of the Army debate team, and he further serves as an editor for the West Point Journal of Politics and Security. He's a senior writing fellow, a stamp scholar, and is a regimental operations sergeant major. Cadet Patrick McGee is an international relations major of the class of 2026 from East Providence, Rhode Island, in his second year with the Army debate team. He is further involved in Model United Nations, Model Arab League, and the International Affairs Forum. Let's hear it for our debaters. To our debaters, I say, think clearly and speak precisely. There is no substitute for victory. To our audience, I hope these debates are as inspiring for you as they are for us. Let us appreciate another exchange of ideas in this historic venue, continuing Fennell Hall's legacy as a place of civic discourse. Please welcome Ms. Danielle Vernio-Gorman, the Naval Academy's Director of Debate, who will guide us through today's speeches.
Hi all, I just want to say how honored I am to be here with you all today, how honored I am to see such an audience for this debate, which had such humble beginnings in sort of the basement of Mahan. Brigadier General Meese was there with us in that very, very first event, and it's been wonderful to see how this has evolved over the past 10 years. So this is the 10th iteration of this event, and I'm really pleased to see how it has grown and how everyone's involvement has increased and shaped the way our mids and our cadets debate. Today, we're going to start by hearing from the debaters at the United States Naval Academy. They will spend 6 minutes advancing an affirmative position in support of the resolution, and then they will be cross-examined for 3 minutes by the team from West Point. So, good luck.
In March of 2023, both the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Center for New American Security conducted a set of war games pitting the U.S. against China over the territory of Taiwan. As described by Max Booth, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, both war games started with the premise that China perceived the U.S. as weakened and distracted and invaded Taiwan while our attention was turned elsewhere. Both war games abruptly ended as the conventional war escalated to the point of nuclear use, but independent analysts conclude that such a war would inevitably escalate to a nuclear exchange between the two superpowers, which would end life on this planet as we know it. Conventional wisdom in military and security circles insists that the above scenario is all but inevitable. China will invade Taiwan by 2027, according to numerous experts such as Dr. Lewis A. Dunn, former Assistant Director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Is there any way to avoid such a scenario? We posit that the best way to prevent such an outcome is for the United States to declare a no first-use policy towards China. Dr. Hans Binnendijk, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former director of defense policy for the National Security Council, and Dr. David Gompert, distinguished visiting professor at USNA and formerly the acting director of national intelligence, argued in March of 2023 that, quote, the U.S. should invite China into a process of nuclear restraint and confidence building, which we call nuclear stewardship. This process could start with a joint bilateral declaration that neither superpower would use nuclear weapons first against the other or its formal allies. This declaration could be the leading edge of a broader set of discussions on strategic stability and eventual implementation of confidence-building measures designed to enhance mutual understanding and trust in the U.S.-Chinese nuclear relationship, end quote. We believe that this process of nuclear stewardship would have two significant benefits. The first one is it would enhance crisis stability between the two foremost military superpowers in the world. And second, it would create the underlying conditions necessary for broader U.S.-Sino cooperation. Crisis is stable if neither side perceives an incentive to use nuclear weapons first out of fear that the other side is about to do so. A stable crisis is still a war, but the war remains conventional. The most obvious disadvantage of our status quo strategic ambiguity is that China is left with the perception that the U.S. might use nuclear weapons at any point in a crisis for any reason, creating a use or lose pressure on China to use first. Thus, the most immediate benefit of a U.S. no first use policy is that it would both eliminate the U.S. ability to use nuclear weapons first in a crisis, and would eliminate any Chinese perception that the U.S. might do so. As China already has a declared no first use policy, the U.S. NFU would be reciprocal, and neither party would be left with the impression that the other is ready to use nuclear weapons. This means that even if diplomacy around Taiwan breaks down and the U.S. and China go to war, the war would not escalate beyond conventional attacks, while a conventional war between the two largest military superpowers in the world would under no circumstance be a net positive. Under crisis stability, it would still be survival. While preventing the use of nuclear weapons in a conflict is in itself an admirable and necessary goal, we further posit that a no first use declaration towards China would create the conditions for broader Sino-US cooperation. Limiting the US first use threat would soften the calcifying divide between US and Chinese interests and bring them to the negotiating table on a variety of issues. Of these, we posit that the most pressing is the development of the North Korean nuclear capability. According to Dr. Benedike and Dr. Gomberg, previously cited, the US and China would converge on the view that no Pacific dispute would justify crossing the nuclear threshold and could turn their joint attention to truly acute dangers. Foremost of these is North Korea's growing reliance on nuclear weapons. The US and China should together pursue denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Disputes with the US over nuclear postures led China to pull out of the six-party talks. A no first use declaration would eliminate a significant point of contention between the US and China, which would do much to bring China back to the negotiating table with Pyongyang. According to Dr. Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in 2022, both China and America want Northeast Asia to be stable, peaceful, and prosperous. Neither desires an aggressive or nuclear North. However, the differences are also significant. First is the overall state of their bilateral relationship. Would an NFU bring China to the table? Dr. Gomberg, writing with Dr. Philip Sanders, Director of Studies at the Center for Strategic Research, argues as early as 2011 that a no first use policy would bring China to the negotiating table over North Korea. Strategic talks could lead to even more significant results. The United States and China could agree explicitly to a mutual nuclear deterrent relationship and even enter into an explicit bilateral no first use agreement. For the United States, the offer of reciprocal bilateral NFU agreements should not be cast narrowly or only as an acceptance of the inevitability or reality of China's ability to enter the United States, but instead as a joint commitment by the world's two strongest powers to a relationship of mutual and growing respect, trust, cooperation, and international leadership in reducing the importance of nuclear weapons in the world affairs. For the United States and China to exchange no first use pledges should bolster the international non-proliferation regime, but a more concrete dividend. In the same spirit would be strong Chinese support to sanction Iran and North Korea. By acceding to China's position on no first use, the United States should expect China to partner with it in preventing nuclear proliferation. Obviously, preventing North Korea from increasing its nuclear aspirations would be an unmitigated good. However, it would also go far towards preventing the collapse of global non-proliferation norms, which are the linchpin of stability in the global system. According to Dr. Matthew Cronin, professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, in 2016, proliferation increases the likelihood of nuclear conflict by an order of magnitude for each nuclear state. Because it increases the number of nuclear armed potential opponents, the most important reason to be concerned about nuclear weapons in Asia, of course, is the threat that nuclear weapons might be used. To be sure, the use of nuclear weapons remains remote, but the probability is not zero, and the consequences could be catastrophic. The dangers of escalation may be magnified in a multipolar nuclear order in which small skirmishes present the potential to quickly draw in multiple powers, each with a finger on the nuclear trigger. The existence of multipolar nuclear powers means that crises may pit multiple nuclear armed states against one another. In addition, conflicts of interest between nuclear powers may inadvertently impinge on the interests of other nuclear armed states, drawing them into conflict. There's always a danger that one nuclear power could take action against a nuclear rival, and that this action would unintentionally cross a red line for a third nuclear power triggering a tripartite nuclear crisis. With that, I stand ready for cross-examination.
All right, so first question, just to clarify, we're stating that the United States should declare no first use policy on weapons, correct?
Against China.
We'll start the time over and try to make sure the mic's close or not. Go ahead. So just to clarify, your plan is that the United States should adopt a no first use policy on nuclear weapons, correct?
A no first use policy against China specifically.
Against China
Yes.
specifically. Okay. And so one of the advantages from this is you believe it would bring China to the diplomatic table, correct?
On the issue of North Korea, yes.
So you believe China would be a good faith actor in these negotiations based purely off no first use policy?
What do you mean by no like good faith actor?
So you believe China would be willing to cooperate with the United States to act against their strategic ally, North Korea, based purely off the United States conceding on no first use?
Well, we already have we already have grounds for this. From 2003 to 2007, the U.S., China, Russia, Japan, North Korea, and South Korea all took part in the six-party talks. With that, that's like the base for China actively talking with the U.S. and other nations to denuclearize Korea. And those talks failed because the U.S. and China did not have any common ground, and the relationship became very tense. So what we aim to do with this NFU is basically to bolster U.S.-China relations. It's like a political marketing tool. If we're able to assume some common ground with them, we are sure that they should at least come to the table again and talk. That's all we want to do with this.
So there's no guarantee China would actually follow through on any diplomatic action against North Korea?
To predict the outcome of like the talks, I would say, no, I can't assure you what the outcomes of the talks are, but it's the assumption that the political bargaining tool of an NFU saying that we're coming to the table, we're basically being less aggressive with you, we're clarifying our intentions with you. We hope that that would further assure them in talks with us.
And then just another further point of clarification, you were saying that proliferation of nuclear weapons is bad, correct?
Across the world, yes, across many other countries.
And then you also posit that no first use would prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
Sorry.
You posit that a no first use policy from the United States would prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
No, actually, we do not posit that. We say that all we're looking for with the first advantage is crisis stability. So the war may still take place. That is something up to the seniors. But what we say is that the war will be stable and conventional. That's all we aim to do. We can survive a conventional war. Nuclear war kills.
So just one final point of clarification. When you say nuclear stewardship, is that you essentially saying dual no first use policies from China and the United States?
Well, yes, it's a bilateral NFU. China already has one.
Okay. And so does the affirmative mean China is firmly in place with their NFU and truly means what they say when they say they will not use nuclear weapons first?
Yeah, I mean, when Dr. Gompert highlighted this in his writings, but this comes from like Mao's era of China, when the CCP was first created. This conception that nukes are more of a political tool than actually a weapon to be used. And we haven't seen them go back on this policy. There's no reason to believe they will go back on this policy. This is a classic Maoist China, and we believe they won't continue this.
Thank you.
So the next thing that's going to happen is that West Point will present their negative argument. They will also have 6 minutes to present their negative position, answering the claims that Navy has made in their affirmative and bringing up other outside claims potentially. And then the next thing that will happen after that 6-minute long speech is the midshipmen will have the opportunity for a 3-minute long cross-examination. So enjoy.
The affirmative proposes a sweeping radical retreat from the strategy that has delivered stability to our allies and the world for nearly 80 years, imagining that nuclear first use is the hinge upon which China's regional aspirations rest, and that the North Korean regime will be appeased if the US agrees to limit its strategic flexibility. You should reject this proposal for 3 reasons. First, the affirmative fails to provide a clear and present risk to the US or its allies. Even their own evidence shrinks from suggesting that no first use is anything more than a conversation starter. Second, the affirmative operates in a form of liberal hegemony that misunderstands both China and North Korea as international actors. Serious assessments of the no first use strategy confirm that far from reducing risk of conflict, it actually increases instability. Third, curtailing the reach of the nuclear umbrella marks the betrayal of our allies, weakening US hegemony and encouraging further proliferation and instability that goes with it. On that first point, US policy has delivered overarching stability and prosperity in the Asian theater since the end of World War II. In the face of this reality, the affirmative offers two arguments. One, that negotiations with China on broader strategic issues are suffering specifically because of America's current declaratory policy. And two, that North Korea's nuclear program is best addressed not by the deterrent holding it back today, but by capitulation to China. They can prove neither claim. Their evidence does not claim that US-China relations are contingent upon no first use, but that US-China no nuclear arms control conversations. So even if this is true, it fails to establish the predicate that nuclear arms control talks are needed to secure the region as opposed to relying on time-tested deterrent. The affirmative further confuses the nature of the conflict. An invasion of Taiwan is far from certain, and nuclear escalation is even less likely. Analysis in the Journal of Strategic Studies indicates that perceiving Chinese strategy as directly confrontational is erroneous. Chinese leaders do not want large-scale war and take steps to prevent it from being necessary. The risk of unintended war escalation, per discussion in Washington Quarterly, is effectively zero. Fail-safe procedures, adaptive technology, a tradition of non-use, and half a century of history disprove escalation. The risk the affirmative seeks to mitigate are non-existent. The disadvantages of no first use are not. On North Korea, China already cooperates in leveling sanctions now. To the extent the affirmative authors contend that China enjoys maintaining North Korea as a buffer state, none of those authors go so far to say that China would not continue to support this buffer in the face of no first use. If they cannot convince you of a clear and present danger from America's first use policy, you must vote negative. Second, on the affirmative's naive worldview. In the words of Dr. John Mearsheimer, we're in a multipolar world now, and the United States faces a fierce competitor, China. In this world, attempts to wield liberal hegemony will only further undermine the US. Mearsheimer describes this approach as incredibly foolish. Broad relational challenges cannot be overcome, and certainly will not be by adjusting NFU to play into China's hand. Dr. Jill Goldenziel of the Marine Corps Command and Staff College describes the CCP's strategy of legal warfare, which, per PLA doctrine, involves, quote, seizing standards and flexibly using them. Legal warfare is used to set conditions favorable to China and hamper adversaries' capacity to respond. China consistently exploits international legal and diplomatic frameworks, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which it routinely violates. Dean Cheng of the U.S. Institute for Peace casts China's engagement with NFU in the same light, a politically motivated tool with little credibility that China is willing to skirt or abandon at a moment's notice. Finally, the affirmative undermines our allies and makes Asia more dangerous. First, declaratory policy is key to preserving peace. Per the DoD's 2022 Nuclear Posture Review, it reflects a sensible, credible, and stabilizing approach to complicating adversary decision-making, deterring rivals, assuring allies and partners, and achieving U.S. objectives if deterrence fails. Policymakers and the DoD have consistently assessed the impacts of transitioning towards a no-first-use policy and have sharply rejected the notion, with the Congressional Commission on Strategic Posture of the United States finding that, quote, the U.S. should not abandon calculated ambiguity by adopting a policy of no-first-use, as the current posture, quote, reinforces restraint and caution on the part of that potential aggressor. A 2019 DoD publication titled Dangers of a Nuclear No-First-Use Policy argues that adoption of NFU, far from reducing the risk of nuclear war, would, quote, increase the likelihood of devastating conflict, including nuclear war, by incentivizing non-nuclear strategic attacks on and coercion of the U.S., allies, and partners, while damaging the credibility of the U.S. deterrent. Per Michael Maza, an AEI fellow, an American NFU policy would enable and encourage a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and potential strikes on regional U.S. bases. Third, a no-first-use policy would specifically embolden domestic forces within Japan and South Korea agitating to become nuclear powers, leading to proliferation with increasing the risk of strategic conflict and miscalculation. Considering Japan, at the 2022 Treaty on Non-Proliferation, NFU proposal efforts were shut down by the U.S. at the behest of Japan, reflecting a history of strong Japanese opposition to the U.S. adoption of NFU policy. This would alienate Japan and have serious ramifications for U.S. strategic planning. The U.S.-Japan alliance is at the center of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, and any damage to this alliance risks Japanese rearmament and potential proliferation in the absence of the U.S. nuclear umbrella per the 2019 Department of Defense release. Caitlin Talmadge of Georgetown School of Foreign Service argues that Japan would perceive a U.S. no-first-use policy as a weakening of U.S. deterrence, leading to Japanese proliferation in the face of existential threats, exacerbating global proliferation and risking nuclear war. A 2007 publication from the Naval Postgraduate School stated that, quote, Japan now possesses the technological, economic, and material means to develop its own nuclear weapons program, and Japanese political and social structures display the motivation to prompt change potentially towards nuclear cooperation with Pakistan. Post-proliferation, China's engagement with smaller actors across numerous dyads is more destabilizing than singular U.S.-China relations. These risks are not unique to Japan. The DoD report noted similar concerns by NATO allies and South Korea, with the South Korean public even more pronouncedly in favor of independent nuclear development.
So my first question, I just want to clarify, you mentioned 3 things at the beginning of one case. Can you basically just go and highlight each?
Sure. So the first main argument we're making is that the affirmative has failed to provide a specific need for the plan in light of the war with Taiwan not being a credible escalation scenario. Secondly, we argue the affirmatives proposed engagement with China operates within sort of naive worldview of liberal hegemony, whereby in reality, when engaging with China here isn't going to produce any mutual benefit. It's just going to enable China to further leverage these diplomatic efforts to its own interests. And third, this is an off-case position, but we argue that the affirmative undermines our allies and makes Asia more unstable, specifically by incentivizing proliferation in Japan and South Korea.
Okay. So on Japan, like disadvantage with Japan proliferating or other Southeast Asian countries proliferating, can you like cite what happens with like conventional deterrence? Where is conventional deterrence taken into account in any of this? And the Japanese government, the Japanese people? I feel like we're focusing solely on nuclear deterrence when we talk about what's going to lose like the faith of the Japanese people. Where does conventional deterrence play a part in any of this?
I mean, conventional deterrence is incredibly important, but realistically, I think, for example, South Korea is a great example of this. We have maybe approximately 25,000 US troops stationed there. Comparing that to the force amassed by North Korea, that's always at a state of mobilization, always on the border. There are concerns that conventional force simply isn't a timely, credible deterrent in the face of such adversaries.
Okay, but your argument states that like nuclear weapons would be, and then therefore the erasure of like strategic ambiguity and cross-proliferation. That's the argument there.
That's right. So Japan and South Korea feel less protected, given that they now no longer believe that in the case of a conventional mass large-scale invasion, the US would intervene with nuclear weapons, and they largely may be uncertain if a conventional response would be adequate or sufficient or executed in a timely manner.
Okay, and then one last point is that I believe I heard you say that an NFU, like the implementation of the US NFU, would cause an invasion of Taiwan, or like increase the likelihood of that.
That's right. So exactly. So the way that works is currently, when adversaries consider potential courses of action, they have the added risk of a US nuclear response. Conversely, under an NFU, China knows that if it invades Taiwan, there is no risk of a nuclear response, and that factors into the calculus.
We're now going to move into the second constructive speeches. Navy will begin, and the second constructive speaker has 2 jobs. The first of their jobs is to extend and expand upon the arguments that they made in their first constructive speech. And the second part of their job is to answer the arguments that West Point has advanced in their first speech. And that constructive speech will again be followed by a cross-examination from West Point. So enjoy.
Do not miss the forest for the trees. Only a nuclear no first use policy towards China is able to preserve life on Earth as we know it. Our authors conclude that conflict in the Pacific is inevitable. War games, economic complexities, and geospatial tensions will all reach a tipping point. Now, the question we must consider is when and how the conflict will end. In the status quo, those conflicts end in nuclear conflict, with the United States using a nuclear weapon first and China retaliating. Similarly, the threat of first use accelerates the time until this conflict happens. China will eventually convince themselves that to avoid this scenario, they will freely invade Taiwan, and that the US will never risk New York for Taipei. The way to avoid this scenario is through bilateral no-first-use agreements. This agreement would show China that the US is serious about conventional deterrence, an actual usable deterrent to protect Taiwan. It's inherently more credible than the nuclear umbrella. This would also allow the US and China to cooperate over North Korea's nuclear arsenal through sanctions. Dr. Gombert pointed out how China can enforce economic sanctions against North Korea as a favor for the US agreeing to a no-first-use agreement. North Korea is comparatively more hot-headed than China, and it's better that we get their nuclear weapons off the table. The first negative argument is that Taiwan war is not inevitable. However, the analysis they're citing is a strategic study from 2016. It does not account for current escalation factors, internal pressures, and economic complexities that our evidence cites, especially when it's from 2023 and describes a war game that happened, and it concludes that the war would happen in 2027. The second argument they bring up is about how there's no precedence for North Korea. However, our evidence is extremely clear on this question. Kim is modernizing the nuclear arsenal now, and it's a question of time until he becomes confident enough in their technology that he can survive a retaliatory strike after he uses a nuclear weapon first. Thus, the sanctions are a more favorable option than later, when later he would use a nuclear weapon. That proves our precedence. Next, they have an argument about deterrence and liberal hegemony. However, Army has gotten this argument backwards. We are the saving grace of hegemony. First, we de-escalate tensions. First strike postures tries to solve a problem that he creates, but engaging in bilateral agreements with China, just the process itself, would soothe tensions in the region. Even since its founding, Mao thought that nuclear weapons were never supposed to be used first, and vowed to not use them like that. Likewise, the US adopting a similar security paradigm towards China, as China has towards the United States, would breed a peaceful parity in this relationship, not escalation. Second, conventional deterrence. A nuclear no-first-use policy towards China would allow the United States to have a greater emphasis on conventional weapons in the South China Sea. From China's continuous provocations in the South China Sea, it's clear that the PLA is not sufficiently deterred by nuclear weapons, because their security leaders know that we would never risk New York for Taipei. However, it's possible to substitute the collapsing nuclear umbrella with conventional weapons. They bring up South Korea and Japan as arguments about why we should keep a first-use policy. However, Eric Gomez, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, explains in 2018 that the United States finds itself in a strategic catch-22. It's practically impossible for Washington to make a nuclear umbrella credible as a deterrent due to the military and reputational problems, so allies can never be reassured. The umbrella is not the only component of deterrence to Japan and South Korea. Conventional precision strike and ballistic missile defense reduces the importance of nuclear weapons. It is the substitute. There is a declining relative importance of nuclear weapons as South Korea and Japan develop conventional capabilities and ballistic missile defenses. Finally, another argument they've made is that China would cheat and that it's not credible. However, none of their arguments assume our bilateral NFU. They're just talking about a broad no-first-use agreement that does not include China in the process. So they need evidence that's specific to our case. But secondly, an NFU is made credible by our plan. The mutually dialogue that would reinforce nuclear stewardship, as Armand brought up. This would generate a dialogue that would generate equal understanding of how nuclear weapons will be used and not to use them first in a nuclear conflict. Finally, they say that it will cause proliferation and other countries will try to develop their own domestic nuclear weapons. However, Army has not brought up that it's impossible for Japan and North Korea to make nuclear weapons. They, 1, do not have the technology. 2, the public is vastly against an independent nuclear deterrent. They've cited zero evidence for this. However, our benchmark card in our first speech says that 95% of the Japanese public and over 87% of the South Korean public are against a nuclear deterrent. Rather, they are in favor of weapons that can be used, weapons that are survivable, weapons that wouldn't cause a conflict that would end the world as we know it. Lastly, they have zero impact to any of their arguments. Our argument is that the world right now, a Taiwan war, would end in nuclear use. They have no way to prevent the Taiwan war from escalating to ending the world as we know it. A conventional conflict, even if it's unpopular, is survivable. But under their arguments, it would end in nuclear use. It's impossible to avoid that way. I'm open for cross-examination.
mentioned that Japan and South Korea don't have the abilities to develop nuclear weapons. What was the source of that claim?
That was our then Japan government evidence in Malaysia.
Okay. So, a recent poll of the South Korean population found that 80% supported the implementation of a nuclear deterrent on South Korean soil. That is not a condition that is currently met, and furthermore, a deterrent that will be eliminated if and if you're how does that comport with your
Yeah, we would say that your poll is incorrect. You provided no evidence or source for this poll. Our evidence says that actually South Korea believes in conventional capabilities because they're useful, they're familiar with them, they believe in ballistic missile defense because you can actually use them without North Korea then launching a nuclear strike on South Korea. Like, your poll is just...
Do Japan and South Korea, are they in favor of the implementation of an energy policy by the United States?
Yes, they believe in their own conventional capabilities as well as the United...
Why at the 2022 summit proliferation did Japan explicitly intervene to block the adoption of NFU?
No, they wrote a broad NFU, one where we can never use nuclear weapons first. Our argument is just towards China.
What actor might Japan be concerned about with regards to NFU?
So this question makes sense in a vacuum. However, it doesn't
It would be
answer...
China.
Yeah, it would be China, but it doesn't answer our arguments about the second strike capability or the increase in the mutual understanding between China and the United States to not cause regional conflicts towards, for example, Japan and South Korea.
When you mention a bilateral NFU, does that necessitate good faith cooperation on the part of China?
It would result in good faith cooperation. You can bring up a lot of examples like the Sea Treaty in the past where they cheated. However, our argument is that it would result in good faith cooperation because it's a shift in the U.S. strategic paradigm and how each country understands nuclear deterrence.
Can you bring up any examples of good faith cooperation?
Sure, the Benjamin government evidence, or for example, the recent summit that Xi and Biden had, they talked about how we should not use nuclear weapons and end the world. They agreed that using nuclear weapons first is probably a bad idea because it would mean that the U.S. and every other country would be enveloped in nuclear war. Our argument is that because they have...
to interject there, you agree that both U.S. and Chinese leaders have agreed to avoid nuclear escalation.
They've agreed to avoid nuclear escalation.
So a nuclear scenario in Taiwan is unlikely.
It's miscalculation event. Yes, leaders can agree. There's no operational or doctrinal changes that have happened because of those events. It's all just talk. The affirmative plan is to result in an actual change from those discussions and how leaders agree so we're not ambiguous in the fact that we could just first strike China.
And now we'll hear from, in a minute, we'll hear from West Point, who's going to do the same thing. They will give their second negative constructive argument. Their job here is to extend and enhance the arguments that they made in their first negative constructive, and then answer the arguments that were raised by the affirmative team in their second affirmative constructive. And that will be followed by a cross-examination, the final cross-examination from the naval camp. Oh, sure.
Each team has a pool of 10 minutes of prep time they can use at their discretion throughout the day.
Recap what my partner said in the first negative constructive. There is no current need for no first use policy from the United States. An invasion of Taiwan is not inevitable. China has shown no indication that they will take further escalatory steps. They are too interconnected in the global system. They are too reliant on global trade, and China is not a credible threat over Taiwan. It is just posturing. Second, there is no belief that China will actually conduct good faith discussions over North Korea or any of these other issues. China is not a good faith actor, as the affirmative has posited, and instead has been shown to go back on diplomatic treaties and their diplomatic word in the past. China is not a good faith actor, and we cannot engage in these discussions with them and make concessions. Third, there is a danger to the United States if we adopt no first use policy. It isolates our allies in Japan and South Korea and creates a dangerous Pacific with potentially more nuclear actors. Something the affirmative themselves has created would lead to escalatory actions in the region and greatly increase the risk of nuclear war. And nuclear war is bad, I think we can all agree on that. Moving on to the idea that China is a bad faith actor, the affirmative themselves have said how China has gone back on specific treaties in the past and uses these treaties to their advantage, as my partner on the affirmative has said. China uses international treaties and international law as a weapon on the stage to increase their favorability if they were to engage in conflict and in diplomatic actions, while subverting and ignoring laws they do not agree with. Also, their entire advantage over North Korea is based off the assumption that China will engage in talks with the United States. This is a completely flawed assumption. The affirmative completely misrepresents their own authors. Dr. Gomberg, the only expert they actually cite on this, says that the United States could and should engage in talks with China through an NFU policy over North Korea. There's no guarantee China would even get to the diplomatic table, much less make any policy going against their known ally and buffer state in North Korea. There's no incentive for China to make concessions on North Korea. While North Korea may be increasing their nuclear weapons posture and capabilities, there is zero indication empirically that China will engage in an NFU discussion and de-escalatory discussion over North Korea with the United States. There's no evidence for this, and their own evidence says it should happen, not that it will. Next, there is no basis for China to trust an NFU pledge from the United States. The United States has had a long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity. A sudden shift in this policy would not be credible from the United States, as China would just see it as diplomatic posturing and not a credible pledge, just how the United States sees China NFU pledge as a wishy-washy policy merely for political benefit. As such, neither actor would actually trust each other in this situation, and there would be no benefits from a US-China NFU policy. Also, their argument on Taiwan completely ignores the reality of deterrence. They posit that a Taiwanese invasion is inevitable, and this will result in a nuclear catastrophe. But as the affirmative brought up, Chairman Xi Jinping and President Biden have engaged in discussions and agreed to no further nuclear escalation over the issue. This alone solves in the current status quo. But on top of this, if they don't believe China is credible in their pledge on this, China cannot be trusted with NFU, and as such, escalatory actions would happen anyway. There's also a misguided understanding of deterrence. If we make a concession to China over NFU, it shows that we are willing to bend to China in face of their aggressive actions and stances in the region, and further encourages and incentivizes Chinese aggression, specifically over Taiwan and other Pacific issues. Moving on to North Korea, Chinese sanctions are already in place, and North Korea has not changed their posture because of it, and China is unwilling to lose its buffer. North Korea will maintain its aggressive nuclear policy regardless of NFU, and even if China were to go to the talking table, North Korea has shown a willingness to back away from China and not stick with them on every stance, and as such, they would likely just ignore Chinese actions. Moving on to Taiwan, again, the affirmative attempts to present a war in Taiwan and nuclear escalation is guaranteed. Again, significant doubts exist to the likelihood of even an invasion, especially in the face of Russia's disastrous invasion of Ukraine. A Taiwan invasion would be even more challenging. As published in Times in 2023, China is unlikely to move against Taiwan soon. Xi has watched carefully as Russian President Vladimir Putin has provided a vivid demonstration of just how unpredictable, costly, and humiliating an ill-conceived war can be. Even if affirmative again conceded in Cross that the US and Chinese have jointly agreed to no nuclear escalation, and war games are underpinned by a litany of assumptions, they are not guaranteed reality, they are a mere prediction. Moving on to the Japan and Korea argument. A 2023 poll from the Wilson Center showed that 71% of South Koreans now support the return of nuclear weapons to their country, even if it means developing their own. We have shown how South Korea could potentially get the ability to create their own nuclear weapons. We have shown how Japan, in the status quo, has the ability to create nuclear weapons. Just because in the status quo Japan does not have the political will to develop nuclear weapons does not mean that a no-first-use policy from the United States would shift Japanese opinion. Japan has shown a continued resilient resistance to an NFU policy from the United States in any form, irregardless of whether it is specifically to China or if it is as a broad policy as a whole. Japan is specifically threatened by China. They are one of the largest strategic rivals in the region, and as such, NFU policy from the United States would greatly alienate Japan, as shown through past Japanese actions, and further incentivize development of nuclear weapons in Japan. Furthermore, we cite the 2007 Naval College study, which indicates Japan can acquire nuclear weapons like if they desire, like we said, and Japanese position is defensive and highly flexible. They would consider rapid changes in conventional rearmament. The DoD itself assesses extensive risks of Asian proliferation. Per further evidence and experts, the organization that has managed and interrogated this policy for over 70 years has guaranteed that these impacts are highly at risk and very likely if they were to occur. As we have shown, NFU is not credible from the United States and China. Escalation would not happen as China will not invade Taiwan, and NFU would just harm US positions across the world. Thank you.
So your first argument on the case is that nuclear deterrence is credible. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Nuclear deterrence is credible, then why would Japan and South Korea getting nuclear weapons not also be a credible nuclear deterrent?
Because as you've said yourself, increase in proliferation in the region greatly increases the risk of war, and specifically nuclear war resulting in annihilation. So even if increased proliferation improves those specific states' deterrence, it creates a multipolar situation in the region which is increasingly unstable.
Okay, so it causes a nuclear war, right?
Yes.
How would that nuclear war accelerate to nuclear weapons if the US was unable to use nuclear weapons in that war?
Because South Korea and Japan would not be beholden to the same pledge. Your own evidence has shown how Japan and South Korea getting nuclear weapons would be increasingly unstable in the region, and
Which evidence was that?
the one you read in your 1AC, I don't remember the specific name of the card, but you did read it.
Okay, so the evidence talks about how they would actually shift towards BMD and conventional strike capabilities, which are actual, credible, usable deterrents. In that world where they shift to that instead of the focus on nuclear weapons, how does that influence escalation?
So in the current status quo, Japan and South Korea are content with increasing their IMDb and air defense and missile defense policy. However, your own evidence from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, Matthew Groen, I might be mispronouncing that name, Kronig, specifically said, this is from your own statement in the 1AC, that an increase of nuclear weapons within the region, specifically Japan and South Korea.
Sure, let's talk about it. It says that as North Korea develops their own nuclear arsenal, it will force these other countries to develop their nuclear weapons. Only the North Korea developing their nuclear arsenal is solvable under the Chinese NFU policy. How do you solve North Korea developing their nuclear weapons?
We're saying it's not solvable, and your plan does nothing to. You just
it's inevitable.
throw out a wish.
It's inevitable.
North Korea developing nuclear
Yeah,
weapons?
it's inevitable.
It might not necessarily be inevitable, no,
So-
but NFU policy does not.
So you can't solve it. You can't solve it under our plan, but suddenly it disappears, and it might not be inevitable under yours.
We're saying there's a decreased risk of these countries feeling the need to create their own nuclear weapons
How-
if they are fully reassured under the nuclear umbrella.
How can that possibly be true when our evidence cites that Kim Jong-un is developing their nuclear arsenal, making it more complex, and will be confident in the future to use nuclear weapons? And this is just the status quo. So I'm confused how you think this will just disappear.
I'm confused how you think you're solving it. You're just emboldening China and hoping and praying that they decide to counteract North Korea when they've shown no indication of desiring to, and they've been bad faith actors in the past.
So China, let's say they enforce their sanctions, their economic sanctions. North Korea has China as their only economic partner. I'm confused how they will be forced then to listen to what China said.
China already has sanctions on North Korea. North Korea has shown a yes, it is true.
Untrue.
They've shown willingness in the past to move away from Chinese policy if it's in their own interest. North Korea is a rational actor, and they will act in their best interest. If China is acting against their best interest, just because China makes a declaratory statement that North Korea should not have nuclear weapons, North Korea is not going to follow that.
Next slide, gentlemen.
Maybe it's going to take a little bit of prep, but just to let you know what's going to happen next, we are moving into the part of the debate which we call the rebuttals. And here, the teams will still attempt to answer each other's arguments and extend the arguments that they have made prior to the debate. But they are also going to be summing up and explaining to the judges why they should vote for one team or the other. And so you'll begin to see a consolidation of strategy and a forwarding of the way the judges should write their bracket. We've also, unfortunately, because I think cross-examinations are the best part of the debate, we've ended the part of the cross-examination, so you will just see 4-minute speeches follow quickly after each other from here on out. So I think maybe still prepping, but enjoy.
Are all the judges ready? So the first thing I would like to address is the negative teams arguments. The opponents of the U.S. No First Use Declaration towards China generally focus on the response that our allies in the region would have, particularly South Korea and Japan. They believe that both countries would be so shaken by a U.S. declaration that we would not use nuclear weapons first that they would acquire their own nuclear arsenals. We would note several things. The first thing we note is that the U.S. would not be withdrawing its conventional umbrella from either nation. The second thing we note is that the U.S. would maintain its commitment to respond to any nuclear attack on an ally from China with a nuclear attack. In the case of South Korea, let us note that South Korea has had a nuclear-armed North Korea on its border for quite some time now, and has not moved towards the development of a nuclear arsenal, which means it is unlikely to do so because the U.S. changes its declaratory policy. Further, if the six-party talks, for example, or similar negotiations over North Korea nuclear weapons resume, South Korea fears of nuclear attacks would be allayed. In the case of Japan, we would point out that there are strong legal and constitutional checks in place preventing the Japanese acquisition of nuclear weapons. In addition to the groundswell of public opinion, we cite in our concrete evidence that 90% of the Japanese population believes that we should abolish nuclear weapons altogether, meaning they are unlikely to support their government in acquiring them. Conventional capabilities mixed with second strike opportunities solve this. It is not that we completely get rid of this nuclear deterrent or nuclear protection. We clarify our intentions, we retain our second strike capabilities. Japan only fights against the broad NFU, not one directly related to China. I just want to point that out. Moving on, our opponents may note that China would be less deterred from regional aggression in a world of a US NFU declaration. Here we refer you again to the mountain of evidence that China is not deterred in the status quo either, while the Taiwan scenario we referred to at the beginning of the speech is perhaps the most likely scenario for Sino-US war in the status quo. There are numerous other hotspots in the region, the Senkaku Islands, for example, where the Philippines being the foremost among them. To be clear, strategic ambiguity is failing to deter China now. I just mentioned those hotspots. There is only a risk that a shifted nuclear strategy creates the underpinnings for a strategic partnership with Beijing that can eliminate the risk of conflicts, or at least eliminate the risk that those conflicts escalate to a world-ending nuclear exchange. China would cheat. This argument does not assume that the US NFU does not assume a US NFU. This argument that they make, China would somehow cheat, China's a bad faith actor. I just want to clarify that the US NFU is a political argument. We are coming to the table to clarify our intentions. They also claim that we have no need for an NFU and that China is somehow not a credible threat. This completely denies the aggressive actions of China, as I mentioned above. On the arguments of stability, it's a catch-22. Dr. Gomez explains that it's inherently uncredible for the U.S. to have a first-strike policy. Politically, as stated in Mitch McConnell's cross-examination, both leaders understand that using nuclear weapons first is a bad policy. However, both operationally and doctrinally, the United States still has the option to use nuclear weapons first, which cause preventative war logic. I want to note that the reason that China has not invaded Taiwan right now is not because of the nuclear deterrent that's present, for there has been and is one since the end of the Second World War. The reason China hasn't invaded is because of conventional deterrence. It is because the entirety of the Seventh Fleet is aimed to defend the island with conventional weapons. The Army has conceded that their study of why Taiwan War wasn't inevitable ignored several current factors like testing red lines with aircraft, nuclear modernization, and island-based expansion because it was conducted in 2016. I'm not sure how they're making their prediction over at West Point, but wargaming is usually how you do it, and it's the most theoretically legitimate study of war in the here and now. The NFU is a political bargaining tool which only makes the Sino-US relationship stronger. The NFU clarifies intentions. On North Korea, we concede that the North's rationale is insofar as they want the best interest. If China enforces sanctions against North Korea, those sanctions, when enforced, would result in the practical collapse of Kim's economy. They continue to develop nuclear weapons. I'd say it's probably in their best interest to listen to those sanctions. The sanctions exist but aren't enforced. We bring China to the table on this specific issue.
Crystallize the arguments that have been made up until this point and to try to compellingly present them in a package that will convince our distinguished judges and panel to vote for them. So, enjoy.
Once again, you should reject the affirmative proposal for 3 reasons. First, they have failed to provide a clear and present risk to the US and its allies. That the risk they identify is an invasion scenario for Taiwan, and the evidence they cite here is a set of war games implications. However, once again, this entire argument hinges on a set of war games that predicts this outcome in South China Sea. But for every paper that says China will invade Taiwan, there is one that government says it won't consider our grammar evidence. They also agreed that both the US and Chinese leaders will take credible steps to avoid nuclear escalation. That was in cross-ex. So there's two hurdles that they have to overcome here. One, the likelihood of a Taiwan war, and two, the likelihood of nuclear escalation. We presented extensive evidence as to why experts agree that both of those are unlikely, right? Especially in the face of Russian operations in Ukraine, especially of China's increasing ambitions as a global peacekeeping force. So the conditions here suggest that an invasion of Taiwan in the first place is questionable. Nuclear escalation is even less likely. Secondly, the affirmative operates in a form of liberal hegemony that misunderstands both China and North Korea. The claims around North Korea suggesting it has a rational basis for its actions is simply incorrect. The purpose of the North Korean nuclear program is to protect the Kim regime. That's it. China does have sanctions on North Korea. They have in place sanctions with regard to nuclear materials. They sanctioned coal trade in 2017. And it's unlikely that China will increase sanctions to the level that they threaten to undermine the Kim regime just because they prefer having North Korea as a buffer state between themselves and South Korean US forces. Moving to our third argument, curtailing the reach of nuclear umbrella marks a betrayal of our allies. That's Japan and Korea, who demand nuclear deterrence. They agreed in cross-ex that Japan rejecting NFU is evidence of its reliance on deterrence. And let's consider the question, why would Japan reject the adoption of an NFU by the United States? It's only in the context of China. They try to claim that Japan rejects broad NFU. Japan doesn't care about Russian NFU, Israeli NFU, right? They're specifically concerned with China and North Korea. Let's also talk about deterrence here. So Kent Walton and Scott Sagan, who have highly contrasting views on nuclear proliferation and deterrence, but agree on a common framework, identify three necessities for deterrence. One, no preventative war during transition to nuclear weapons. Two, that all states must develop second strike capability. And three, not prone to accidental or unauthorized use. Currently, that holds in the status quo. However, upon a nuclear transition for South Korea and Japan, China might see this as the only opportunity to engage in a preventative war. States may not invest sufficiently to develop second strike capability, and given the novelty of these systems and programs, unauthorized use mistakes are likely. Consider the history of US nuclear development with a litany of mistakes and errors. And so, once again, the development of these weapons for Japan and Korea leads to proliferation, leads to nuclear war. The DoD agrees on this. Now, we must consider also public opinion and sentiments in Japan and Korea. They completely dropped our Korea arguments in their last speech. So we've established that Korea, again, the vast majority of Korean nationals, Korean citizens, agree that Korea needs nuclear deterrence. They need nuclear deterrence present on South Korean soil. And they're willing to develop their own weapons, and they have the capability to do so, and they will do so in the absence of the US declaratory policy. Japan is more complicated, but once again, they strongly oppose NFU adoption by the United States. We have demonstrated from our naval postgraduate study that the status quo in Japan is highly susceptible to change. Just look at the changes on Japanese conventional rearmament. Now, considering conventional means more largely, they have provided credible sources to suggest why conventional means are the form of deterrent in Taiwan, and we've provided extensive evidence to suggest that the Taiwan invasion happens because the US removes its current declaratory policy.
Midshipmen still have a little bit of prep time left, so there will be a slight delay before the final rebuttal, but what you're going to see is Midshipman Connor stand up and make an impassioned defense for why we should have a no first use policy. And so stand by for that. It's coming in a minute now. Enjoy.
In the assurance that it will be a stable crisis, one remaining conventional wins the debate. For even in the specific instance of Taiwan war and North Korean nuclear modernization, the inevitable conflicts in the future are hotspots that we need to resolve. But only Navy resolves those. First is the Taiwan War. The Taiwan War is coming now, and the negative has zero way to solve for any such conflict. If you look at the overview of this debate, the affirmative highlights that it's highly unstable in the status quo. They are citing, once again, war games conducted in 2016, ours is from 2023. They consider the most recent factors, like trade embargoes, island expansion, deterrence provocations, none of which are resolved by the negative. One which clarifies intentions, one which reduces regional tensions and brings China to the table is not the status quo, but it's the affirmative plan. In response to their negative impact, they have provided no impact to not proposing and going after the affirmative plan. They claim that China would skirt around and that other allies might become uncomfortable, but ultimately they provide no concrete reason not to implement such policy or how that would cause escalation. As I must remind all of you, the US still retains both conventional deterrence and second strike capabilities, which are sufficient to 1, have a capable and credible deterrent, and 2, not cause massive world-ending nuclear escalation, because as they said, nuclear war is bad. Now, they've conceded that North Korean nuclear arsenal is inevitable, offensively oriented, and can't be stopped in the status quo, which frames how you understand this debate. Kim Jong-un will 1, become confident in his nuclear weapons, and 2, use them if he has this overconfidence. How do they respond? They don't. There isn't a present way to stop Kim from launching his nuclear weapons if he achieves the defensive on offensive capabilities and confidence of making that nuclear weapon. It's just a question of time. Only which can be fixed by the US making its best effort to get China on board with sanctions. Army is right. We did strategically concede that North Korea is out for their best interests, but this flips affirmative. What they forgot to answer was that an economic collapse of North Korea is probably not in their best interests. Secondly, Chinese sanctions are the only way to stop this interest. Yes, they're right that they have sanctions, but even the coal sanctions and how China embargoed the coal, they broke that sanction the next day. It was just a political measure. So the only way to get China on board with this is through the nuclear no first use as a bargaining chip, then those will be enforced against North Korea. Negative sets the world up for legitimate, inevitable nuclear conflict that they have no way to resolve. And if there are uncertain parts of our affirmative case, you should at least default to a way of solving those problems and not letting them cause the end of the world. Finally, they dropped that conventional weapons reassure allies more than nuclear weapons. This was our Dr. Gombert evidence and our Dr. Gomez evidence. By the devastating emphasis of nuclear weapons, it's a catch-22. There's no way to have a credible nuclear deterrent because once it's used, it can never be unused and will cause miscalculation. But conventional weapons are comparatively more credible. They're a credible deterrent and can be used. Even if Army is right that Japan and South Korea want a nuclear weapon, they want a stronger, more usable reassurance through conventional capabilities which can be used and used in a way to deter great powers such as North Korea or China if they escalate in the region.
West Point is going to use the remainder of their prep time as well, but I expect when they stand up, we'll see Cadet McGee in the same impassioned defense of the United States status quo strategic ambiguity and why it is critical to save the world. So, looking forward to that. Enjoy.
Distinguished judges, if you trust the Department of Defense, you should trust that no first use policy is an inherently bad and dangerous decision. The role of the affirmative is to show why a world in which the United States adopts no first use policy would be more stable and safer than the current world. The affirmative has failed at this in multiple ways. First, their assumption of a time-based invasion of China is inevitable, and this will spark a nuclear war. This is categorically false. We provide evidence from 2023, that's Bremer, which concluded a number of contemporary studies in war games that actual risk of Chinese military action against Taiwan remained low, a nuclear escalation non-existent. This assumption, again, that nuclear war would occur is non-existent. As we've shown by our evidence, China is unwilling to conduct an invasion of Taiwan in the status quo. Second, their reliance on a singular war game is overblown. The United States lost the Soviet Union in multiple war games during the Cold War. And let me ask everybody here, which nation still exists today? Their over-reliance on this one piece of evidence ignores a variety of strategic differences in the current status quo, and that China will not invade Taiwan and will not aggress in this way. Third, they have failed to address how NFU emboldens China. The affirmative attempts to paint China as both an inevitable aggressor and potentially a trustworthy ally. China is neither and definitely not both. Assuming China is an inevitable aggressor aggressor, NFU would embolden them. If China is merely a bargaining chip, as the affirmative has suggested, then it is one that signals U.S. weakness to China. It will continue its aggression, invade Taiwan, and war will occur. Under the affirmative framework, at a minimum, Taiwan is gone. In the status quo, at least Taiwan has a chance under nuclear deterrence. Overwhelmingly, experts from both Congress and the DoD agree that NFU increases the likelihood of devastating conflict and nuclear war, exacerbating the risk of Taiwanese invasion. Prefer a more nuanced analysis of the affirmative's blanket statements of inevitable conflict. Additionally, they failed to address that U.S. and China leaders will do whatever necessary to avoid miscalculation, something they agreed to earlier. Again, China also does not play ball. There is no bilateral relation, and this has been proven by a litany of U.S. errors, U.S. Nixon visit, introduction to the World Trade Organization, formulation of conventions of the sea. Each time we agree to bring China into the fold, it exploits this position. That is a strategy of legal warfare the affirmative has not addressed in one speech. The Kim regime is predicated on survival, weapons are defensive in nature. The Kim regime has proved over and over that economic collapse will not stop them. They still develop nukes, and they are still in power despite multiple economic collapses. Also, China is on board with limited sanctions, but they will never allow North Korea to cease as a buffer state. Additionally, the affirmatives themselves have shown China will consistently impose sanctions on North Korea, only not to follow them through. They have shown no evidence that China would be more willing to enforce sanctions in the world of NFU. Also, a non-nuclear North Korea is not inevitable, but the affirmative waste U.S. efforts and resources better spent elsewhere on a cost of failure. Moving on to Korea and Japan. Deterrence isn't equal. Status quo is stabilizing, but proliferation in Asia is not. Japan is highly opposed to China-specific NFU, as communicated to the U.S. They conceded this in cross-ex. Japan can develop nuclear weapons. This is highly susceptible to change its positions. That's a nuclear postgraduate school, something they also haven't contended. Japanese population is opposed to nukes at large, but recognizes the necessity in light of adversarial nations open to reform. Allies do not believe it's a credible deterrent. There is a credible deterrent under NFU. If conventional weapons provided sufficient assurance, then allies wouldn't be clamoring at us to avoid NFU. Korea is incredibly hawkish on nukes, 80% in favor of domestic development. They can and will do this, and given nuances to deterrence dynamics, this will lead to war. Korea is only sufficient with conventional deterrence under a non-NFU policy from the United States. Adopting an NFU policy would spur our allies in Japan and South Korea to develop nuclear weapons, at a minimum, risking our diplomatic relations with them, and at maximum, resulting in nuclear war. The affirmative has failed to show why their plan is better than the current status quo, and why enacting NFU will not result in a nuclear war, destroying the entire world, spanning from Japan and South Korea in proliferation. Thank you.
That concludes the speeches. Our judges will now deliberate.
Start with best speaker to keep the tension high. By 1 point, the top speaker is Midshipman Connor. And the winner of this debate on a 3-2 ballot is the United States Naval Academy.
No pressure.
As much as I hate to admit it, I voted for Navy, and did so because I think they pulled through more of the argument. It went substantially off base. The way that you could have voted for Army was that basically we're arguing all of their negative construction. That's what was driving what's going on. But I think on China, you would convince me of the leading possibility of a war in Taiwan, and that the best way to solve that was no first use. Also, in Japan and Korea, I didn't see any imminent you drop the proliferation impacts, that somehow this is going to proliferate worldwide. There isn't any terrible harm from that, and I thought you pulled that through. That was the catch-22 argument. And then also, if there was going to be any solvency on North Korea, that would have flowed the negative, or the affirmative.
operated similarly. I think that one thing that is important to note is the extensive arguments about conventional deterrence, ballistic missile defense, the other capabilities that might reassure our allies. I thought you all made a strong case that both South Korea and Japan would consider nuclear weapons, their own nuclear arsenals, but I'm not sure that really occurred against the backdrop of knowing that the U.S. will still possess second strike capabilities, that there are a number of other capabilities that they will use to reassure the allies. I think you're right that the allies would be nervous or concerned about the introduction of a no first use policy, but I'm not sure that all of the arguments really accounted for the different ways in which the allies might be persuaded not to nuclearize, but just they could express some concerns over U.S. strategy without going to that full extent. And the Naval Academy was good at pointing out the ways in which the existing strategy of strategic ambiguity is not succeeding. If China is going to pursue an invasion of Taiwan, if China is unwilling to help us negotiate with North Korea now, then it doesn't seem like our existing declaratory policy or our existing posture is really achieving the ends that we want. And so, even though there might be some concern about allied proliferation, which I thought you all were overall better in that portion of the debate, I'm not sure that set of concerns is sufficient to kind of stick with a policy that may end in failure.
The other thing I was going to say is it was, as reflected in the decision, an incredibly close debate. It could have gone either way, I think, for many of our ballots. And I commend both teams for doing an exceptional job of adapting to normal debate. Everybody here said how fast it was. I said it's about half speed. Normal debating is. So thank you all very much.
And actually, I want to add, because my job is to analyze presidential debates. If the Republicans who are debating right now could come here and listen to what you did in half the time that they have, they would be ashamed. You all represent your academy so well. And I'll say to you guys, you spoke to what I want, and for Army, you spoke to what I believe. So, congratulations, you put our politicians to shame.
That concludes the formal portion of our event. If you'd like to speak with either